My name is Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services each semester. This semester, we're highlighting the new perspectives and fresh voices at UW-Whitewater. We've had a lot of new faculty and staff who've joined us over the past 2 or 3 years, including today's presenter. We had her predecessor here a few years ago, so it's really nice to have her here. I'll introduce her now. She is Ashley Dibbing. She's the Crossman Gallery Director at UW-Whitewater. There, she oversees both the Crossman Gallery and the Community Engagement Center Gallery and teaches art history in the Department of Art and Design. After completing her PhD in the history of art at the University of Michigan in 2019, she worked as the interim curator of Islamic art at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Her fields of specialization include the art and architecture of the Islamic world, particularly Turkish and Persian spheres during the early modern and modern periods. With a fine arts background in fiber arts and weaving, Dibbing is especially interested in textiles across the Islamic world. She has served on a number of professional boards and has published in various scholarly journals, edited volumes, and she has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the residencies at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations in Istanbul. She holds 2 Master of Art degrees from Indiana University, Bloomington, and the Koç University in Istanbul, as well as a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the Kansas City Art Institute. Please welcome Ashley Dibbing.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you for that introduction, Carrie, and for inviting me to speak with you all today. I actually want to give a little bit of a reintroduction to myself now, a little bit more casually in how I came to Whitewater. So I'm actually originally from Milton. Ancestry, hey. Ancestry.com tells me I'm actually an 8th generation resident of Rock County. But after high school, I needed to get out and see the world. And so I spent the next almost 20 years getting multiple degrees, living in different places around the country and the world, particularly Istanbul. I spent about 4 years there cumulatively, just sort of on and off over a number of years. I also spent a year in Florence and have finally come home. As much as I love traveling the world, Wisconsin and Rock County was always home. And so it was a real pleasure to be offered this position as the Crossman Gallery Director here at UW-Whitewater, where I'm able to participate in the artistic community of this region, finally, and work with students, work with contemporary artists, and also teach. So I get to kind of do a little bit of everything. As Carrie mentioned, I also have my Bachelor's of Fine Arts, meaning a studio art degree in textiles, which is definitely going to inform my talk here today. And as such, my art making practices really led me down the path of wanting to study the history of textiles, which definitely leads to my talk here today. And this is perhaps the most niche of a topic we could possibly get, but I hope to take you on a journey with me essentially through the discoveries that I made while researching in Europe for my PhD thesis. I did complete that in 2019, but I'm hoping on turning that into a publishable book here in the next couple of years, so stay tuned for that. To get started, can we maybe turn the lights down a little? I wanted to dim the lights a little bit. I hope that's okay, just so that you can see the luscious detail of the things that I'm going to show you here today. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand or save them for the end. I'll be happy to have a robust discussion with you after the talk. So my PhD thesis, which, as I said, will hopefully become a book here shortly, was on the tents used by the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. And so just a little refresher from your history classes, the Ottoman Empire was an empire ruled by Turkish Muslims from around the year 1300 until 1922, which is a significant amount of time. We're talking from the Black Death to the Cubs winning the World Series. It's significant, right? And their capital was, for most of that time period, the city of Istanbul, where I spent many years, and I'm actually teaching a class on the whole history of Istanbul from the Stone Age to now, essentially, over at Whitewater. But when I say tents, the word doesn't really do justice to what I'm talking about. These are really fabric palaces, and I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of what we'll be looking at. And these are absolutely incredible. It's hard to even do them justice through photography like this, but you see here a person for scale. I always tell my students to look for the people in the picture. It'll show you how big something is. So these are monumental architecture just made of fabric. And this will just lead into, we'll see a number of examples of these. So over the 6 centuries that the Ottoman sultans ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents, tents were vital to court life. They were taken on hunting expeditions, military campaigns, and diplomatic missions. They featured prominently in sultans' coronation ceremonies, royal weddings and funerals, and religious holidays. There's even some records of tents being, royal tents being the site of murder, but that might be another lecture. Tents were erected in the city of Istanbul, in the palace gardens, and taken across continents as luxurious, yet portable, fabric architecture. The truly remarkable thing about these monumental fabric structures, hold on, let me see if is that many still exist. A couple hundred tents survive from the 1700s and 1800s, and those are by and large still in museums in Istanbul. The storehouses of the Sultan's tents just became museums after the end of the empire. But there are a few dozen or so that survive, either whole or in part, from earlier centuries. So we're talking the 1500s and 1600s. And those are primarily in collections across Europe. Museums from Madrid to Stockholm, St. Petersburg to Athens. And this particular tent is in the Wawel Royal Castle in Krakow, Poland. And in fact, Poland has the largest number of Turkish tents outside of Turkey. And this afternoon, we're going to talk about why that is, because it's a fascinating little anecdote from history. But first, I just want to point out really some of the fantastic artistry of these tents. Actually, do I have any quilters in the room? Yeah, hopefully you can kind of recognize how much time and skill would have to go into creating these. This is entirely appliqued. We have a dozen or so different colors of dyed fabric at a time when, of course, dyeing would be done with natural dyes. Each little leaf and petal cut out individually and stitched onto a blue ground fabric here. The overall sort of scheme of it is architectural. So these are tents, but you see here we have columns and arches that resemble architecture made of stone and hard materials. But it is just flooded with flowers, and the Ottomans loved their flowers. They have flowering gardens everywhere you could possibly see, and within their art, just flowers abound across every medium. And this particular tent actually took 20 years to conserve. So the conservators and curators in Krakow got grant funding to be able to accomplish this, where they cleaned every tiny little bit of it in a way that ensured that it would be kept and preserved for centuries still to come. But it took a full 20 years to do so. So when I first embarked upon my research for my dissertation, this was about 10 years ago, I had drawn up a kind of roadmap to find all of the Ottoman tents across Europe over a summer or two. And I began in Vienna, which for reasons that will become clear as I go through the talk, as well as several sites in Poland and Germany. And I thought I knew what I was looking for. But the best research seems to come out of the surprises and the discoveries that you make along the way. So while visiting Wawel Castle in Krakow to see this specific tent, I went there to see this one and one alone. The curators there, Magdalena Ozga and Magdalena Piwocka, suggested that I also look at the museum's photography archive. And they pointed me to a particular series of black and white photographs that they thought I would find interesting and perhaps useful for my research. In this photograph, I immediately recognized the walls of this famous blue tent, the one that I just showed. So we have those here all along the back wall of this large sort of audience hall within the castle. This beautiful coffered ceiling here. On the walls on either side were covered with the sections or the walls of another very famous tent. This is called the red tent. So you have walls here and here that match, and then this one is the blue tent that I showed on the previous slide. But it wasn't until Dr. Ozga pointed out the bust here on the left that I really fully appreciated the strangeness of this image. The bust was a portrait of Adolf Hitler, and this is a Nazi movie theater draped in 17th century Ottoman tents. So this, of course, led to many questions. Did the Nazi officials stationed here know what these textiles were? Did they learn of their history and how they came to be in Krakow? The Nazis were notorious for their seizure and stealing of art and artifacts. This is where we get the Monuments Men fame. And why exactly were they being used as a cinema? And how did they even survive the Second World War? I mean, not to mention the centuries in between. So this really was just a slap in the face of when I thought I knew what I was looking for, and then something like this shows up and it puts you down a whole new path. So I'll be honest, I don't have answers to most of those questions to this day. Sometimes there just isn't the evidence to support a particular hypothesis, though one can speculate, and I will come back to this to do so at the end of my talk. But as I said, what this strange discovery did was lead me down a new path and make me ask different questions about the art and architecture I had set out to study. I'd wondered for the first time what these tents meant to people outside the Ottoman Empire, and what were they used for after they were no longer mobile palaces for the sultans. So from the 1600s to now, who owned them, who saw them, and what did they think about them? This is what I've called sometimes the afterlives of the tents. And this is a theme that some art historians use as well, that de-emphasizing who made them and why they were made initially, but what happened after. These things survive the centuries, and what stories can they tell us? So let's go back and start at the beginning. How did these tents leave the Ottoman Empire? The story begins in 1683, when the Ottoman Sultan had great ambitions of expanding his empire farther west into Central Europe, because so far they have already garnered control over most of Eastern Europe. So in this campaign to expand the empire, the Sultan's second in command, the Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, and his armies marched westward with the aim of conquering the city of Vienna in what is today Austria. Of course, the rulers of Europe weren't just going to let that happen. The Allied troops of Europe were united under the leadership of the Polish king, Jan Sobieski. And indeed, Sobieski was successful in putting an end to the Ottoman expansion. They were never able to get past Vienna. This put a stop to their imperial expansion forever, essentially. So let's put ourselves on the battlefield at the moment of victory or defeat, depending on which side you're on here. And on the 13th of September, 1683, the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, wrote a letter to his wife declaring that he had defeated the enemy Turks and saved the whole of Europe from the invading Muslims. And here I'm showing a slide of a tent that is on display today in Vienna. And again, we'll come back to look at this a little later. The letter explicitly states that he is writing while sitting in the tent of the Ottoman Grand Vizier. The Polish king writes, quote, "The vizier abandoned all in such haste that he barely took one horse and one robe. I have become his successor as I have taken on his splendors." And Sobieski specifies what these splendors were. "I was informed by one of his courtiers where his tents were, which were as large as Warsaw or Lviv," meaning an entire city. By this account, it would seem, as was true in the Ottoman Empire as well, that capturing the tent of another was tantamount to that person's defeat. And so, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, the tents that were once extraordinary imperial architecture made of fabric became war trophies, symbols of the Allied European forces' victory, and more specifically, the Polish king's heroic triumph. And as is well known, history is written by the victors. And the case of the Ottoman tents captured at the Battle of Vienna in 1683 is no different. The battle became so iconic in the cultural imagination of Europe, and Poland in particular, that Jan Sobieski came to be known as the Wizard King for saving the whole of Europe, and by extension, all of Christendom, from the invading Muslims. Over the centuries, these grand tent trophies were exhibited on various occasions, and by doing so, their power and prestige only grew and snowballed over time. So let's look at another tent, also in Krakow, but in a different museum. The shape of this tent is, yet again, slightly different from the ones I've shown thus far, but it's very typical of Ottoman tent styles. This is what we call a marquee. And I think I have, yes, here. This is a manuscript painting showing a depiction of an Ottoman sultan in the front of his encampment, which might be the size of the city of Warsaw, with a marquee situated right at the entrance. So it's functioning as this ceremonial stage setting and grand entrance to the imperial encampment. Now, this particular marquee is in the collection of the Czartoryski Foundation, a museum originally founded by one Princess Isabella Czartoryska in 1796. The museum, as she envisioned it, was, quote, "dedicated to preserving the memory of Poland's past and its place in history," end quote. Indeed, memorializing Polish history was especially important in her time, the late 1700s, as this is the time when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was getting torn apart at the seams, what they called partitioning, by the neighboring powers. So without getting too into the weeds of Polish political history, suffice it to say that this was a time of great uncertainty. And therefore, there was a desire to remember and in some ways attempt to revive the glory days of the Wizard King, Jan Sobieski. And so with the founding of institutions like Princess Czartoryska's collection, we already have instances where historical objects, especially those dating to a golden age of power and prestige, were used to garner a sense of Polish pride through their public display and exhibition. And so, perhaps ironically, Turkish tents become a potent symbol of Polish pride. Now, in the subsequent century, so now we're in the 1800s, Poland celebrated the 200th anniversary of King Jan Sobieski's victory. In that year, 1883, a narrative account of the events was published. The author of this pamphlet describes the Wizard King and his many victories on various battlefields, which ultimately led to the accession to the Polish throne and his career culminating in the victory at Vienna against the Ottomans in 1683. The author dramatizes events and takes special care to place the Ottoman Grand Vizier's tents at the center of the story. According to this pamphlet, after the European Allied troops arrived in Vienna that day in September, they were dazzled by the expansive, glittering encampment, which Jan Sobieski himself compared to an entire city in his letter to his wife. Here, though, the tents come into play not in the aftermath of the battle, but in its key turning point. The author tells us that Sobieski had given up for all hope for the day of the grand struggle, when the provoking composure of Mustafa, whom he espied in a splendid tent, tranquilly taking coffee with his two sons, roused him to such a pitch that he instantly gave orders for a general assault, and he himself made toward Mustafa's tent, beating down all opposition. According to this colorful version of the story, then, not only were the Grand Vizier's tents trophies of victory, it was the tents themselves that actually caused the victory. Apparently, seeing the invading Grand Vizier relaxing in his ostentatious tent is what motivated Sobieski to attack and subsequently win the battle. Regardless of the story's historical accuracy, the fact that this story was published in conjunction with the display or exhibition of the historic tents undoubtedly increased the tents' cultural cachet as trophies of victory and relics of the celebrated Polish king. Now, this pamphlet was reprinted a century later. So now we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of the Battle of Vienna in 1983. And yet again, across Poland, exhibitions were held to commemorate the victory and thereby bolster Polish national pride. Here, a photograph shows one of the halls in Wawel Royal Castle in Krakow, as it was decked out on this occasion in 1983. The exhibition was called The Symbolic Entry of Polish Troops into the Captured Turkish Camp. And it featured this appliqued marquee, right here, from the Czartoryski collection, shown here. In the exhibition, the tent was erected on a platform in the corner of a great hall inside the castle. And incidentally, this is the same hall that was used by the Nazis as a cinema. You can recognize that from the coffered ceiling here. On the ceiling, too, we have several large war banners hung above one's head, making them reminiscent of flags waving on a battlefield. And surrounding the tent, we have a number of different artifacts from war. So saddles, shields, sabers, all different kinds of arms and armor, which very often are beautifully decorated in much the same way that the tents are. On the adjacent wall over here, we have a large-scale painting of the hero king, Jan Sobieski, astride a rearing steed. The exhibition is, in essence, a diorama of the hero king Jan Sobieski, of the hero king's battle. Is a diorama of the climax of the battle, allowing museum visitors to place themselves in the fight and witness the very moment when Jan Sobieski saved Europe from the invading Ottoman armies. And therefore, they can imagine taking part in that great victory and feeling a part of their own history. A few years later, by 1994, the marquee was featured as a central part of a new display in the Czartoryski Museum. And this is the same museum established by Princess Isabella in the late 1700s. The new display was dedicated to Jan Sobieski, probably not a surprise now, and all of his great military accomplishments, chief among them the 1683 victory over the Ottomans. However, this tent was never at the Battle of Vienna. At one point in time, the tent was thought to have been the tent won in the battle in 1683. But as the research of several scholars, myself included, has shown, it wasn't. But here's where it gets even more interesting as we trace the complicated history of Ottoman tents in Poland over the centuries. In the years after the Great Battle, and here we're looking at a painting done about a decade later, wherein we have the king, Jan Sobieski, here riding his large rearing steed. And in the middle ground here, you can see the Ottoman encampment with these beautiful, huge decorated tents and the city of Vienna sort of in the background. In the years after the Great Battle, Jan Sobieski's capture of the Grand Vizier's tents generated a market for Turkish tents in Poland. The Polish nobles who could afford it might actually just travel to Istanbul to buy a luxurious tent for themselves or order a custom one to be made. At the same time, new workshops were established in Poland to make tents that looked like Turkish tents for this burgeoning local market, supply and demand. These workshops employed both artisans who had traveled from the Ottoman Empire to Poland, as well as native Polish craftsmen. And it is worth noting here that the art of tent making in the Ottoman Empire is primarily dominated by men. Women have other textile arts, namely embroidery, but that's a question I get often. So so it became fashionable, in another word, to own a Turkish-style tent in Poland. And through the fog of history, many of these tents, regardless of how they actually got to Poland, became associated with Jan Sobieski's victory. So every estate of Polish nobles who maybe bought a tent off of some guy or traveled to Istanbul to buy one for themselves, they start saying, oh yeah, this is the one. This is the one that the king won in battle. Isn't it beautiful? And then all of a sudden we have 1 million tents being ascribed to the Great Battle. So one Turkish-style tent that was actually made in Poland in the 1700s is now on display in the regional museum in the city of Tarnów. This is not far from Krakow, just sort of a neighboring town. And here we have a gallery, and you can see the tent walls here are not set up in the same way as they are in Wawel Castle, like a tent. The walls, okay, sorry. The tents are just sort of hanging along all sides of the wall, and I'll touch a little bit later on what's in the cases here. The overall composition of the applique tent walls does indeed resemble earlier Ottoman tents. And so here I'm doing a comparison. Here's the tent, a section of the tent in Krakow with all of the beautiful little bits of embroidery and applique. And here as well, we have the same techniques being used, almost the same color palette, but there are really stark differences here. So again, if you look at it as a cursory glance, you'll you'll see the archway formation, same here. This sort of lobed medallion form, same here. So there are a lot of similarities, but a couple of the main differences are the proportions of things. You can see this part is out of proportion with this kind of tiny column here, but also the difference of color. So here we have all of the columns and arches are the same throughout. And in this one, it goes from green to red to white and so on and so forth. It's a little bit hard to see here because the people at Tarnów, this is one of the horror stories of doing research on these things. This tent was lent to the Palace Museum in Istanbul for an exhibition right around the year 1999-2000. And the palace in Istanbul said, oh, well, we'll clean it for you too. And as I mentioned earlier, like this tent took millions of dollars and 20 years to clean. And these ones did not take so much care with it, so it actually lost a lot of its color. It faded extensively because they did not clean it properly. It totally took a lot of the color out of it. So it's a little bit harder to see the subtleties of the color scheme, but trust me on that one. So upon closer inspection, we do see more of these differences that demarcate this tent as being one made in Poland, not Turkey. And one of the most telling parts is this detail here. This sort of cross-hatching where you have a cord of yarn being sort of whip-stitched onto a backing you can see it here, and this is a detail of it here. I have never seen this particular detail on any tent made in Turkey, and at this point I've seen a lot of them. However, the market for such imitation tents made to look like Ottoman tents cannot be solely attributed to their association with Jan Sobieski and the Battle of Vienna, though he does take a lot of the credit. But these kinds of tents had been circulating amongst Polish nobles well before the battle in 1683. The battle at Vienna merely perpetuated and bolstered a pre-existing trend. It also added those new layers of meaning to the fabric structures, as I've already discussed. And at the Regional Museum of Tarnów, the room in which the tent is displayed exhibits other articles that demonstrate a strong affinity for material objects that have a kind of Oriental flavor, such as sashes and saddles. We see those curved sabers here that are very distinctive of the East. But these objects are not exotic souvenirs bought by Polish nobles. Rather, the Polish noble class, called Szlachta, aligned their fashions with those of their Eastern neighbors because they thought they were descended from an ancient Eastern culture, the Sarmatians. So this ancient Eastern culture, the Sarmatians, they were a nomadic, military-minded people who were believed to have migrated from the Black Sea region over to where is Poland today, eventually settling there and thus becoming the Polish noble class over many centuries. So this Sarmatian or Eastern heritage was one of the defining characteristics of early modern Polish fashion for the nobility in particular, which was the citizenry. So this was in some ways a democracy, but really only for the noble class. So that's the demographic we're talking about here. In other words, Polish elites celebrated their heritage, their identity, and even declared their political allegiances through fashion, and specifically anything that associated them with the East, including Ottoman tents. So in short, the Ottoman Turkish tents were repurposed as powerful symbols of Polish identity and pride in more ways than one, both through connecting the Polish nobility to their ancient Eastern heritage represented in the early modern fashions, and through Jan Sobieski's victory on the battlefield against the Ottomans. And I will recognize, though they didn't, that there is an irony here in the fact that the Polish nobles in this period are using Eastern fashions to identify themselves and their heritage while also battling the folks to the east and wanting to demonstrate their conquest over them. So they were fine with that, but I think it's worth noting that there does seem to be a little bit of hypocrisy there, but they were fine with it. Okay. Ooh. Another tent, sorry, I keep hitting the side of this. Another tent that can tell us about the many meanings behind Ottoman tents in Poland is in the collection of the Wilanów Palace Museum. Here it is. So the tent you're seeing here, in this photograph is from the early 20th century, and the tent itself did not survive the 20th century. So we actually only have 2 fragments of this left, and the evidence that we have to work from is this black and white photograph. But I'll show you the 2 fragments here momentarily. So as I said, this is in the Wilanów Palace Museum just outside of Warsaw, and it is the site of one of Jan Sobieski's royal residences. Over the centuries, after the king passed, the estate changed hands several times and underwent various updates and restorations before coming into the hands of one Stanislaw Kotowska-Potocki in the early 1800s. It was under his stewardship that the historic private residence was first converted, at least in part, into a publicly accessible national museum dedicated to the king Jan Sobieski. And in order to draw crowds to his new museum, Potocki aimed to recover the former king's collection of art and personal effects. And of course, the hero king's collection would never be complete without the Grand Vizier's tent that he won in the Battle of Vienna in 1683. And so Potocki purchased this tent thinking that it was the legendary tent. But as I have shown thus far, there were many such tents in Ottoman styles or even made in the Ottoman Empire circulating in Poland at this time. And so it's really hard to say which one is the one from the battle. But if we look closely, we will see this is not it. This was not the tent won in the 1683 battle. At first glance, the fragments that survive and in whole in this photograph does show similarities to 17th century Ottoman tents. So we have again the archway with the sort of scalloped edges, the lobed medallion here at the center, floral decorations, and even tulips, which are a symbol of the Ottoman Empire. They use that almost as a branding for themselves. However, several key features of the tent reveal that it was not indeed made in the Ottoman Empire or was won in the Battle of Vienna, but this was, in fact, a Polish production. Elements like the different colors of the arches, as you can see here. So again, even though this is a black and white photograph and the Tarnów tent was faded, we can still see that we have this sort of alternating colors. And here too, even though these fragments are removed from the tent as a whole, one has a white background and one has a red background. This is not something the Ottomans did. This is a Polish invention. So this tells us that this tent was made in Poland. Another little detail in those tulips that I showed earlier is this cross-hatching pattern, which again, as I said, is not something that you ever see in Ottoman tents. So this here again corroborates the hypothesis that this tent was made in Poland, and it was not the Grand Vizier's. So, nevertheless, while my analysis and other scholars has demonstrated that this tent did not belong to the Ottoman Grand Vizier and did not belong to the Polish king Jan Sobieski, it was still used to bolster Polish national pride through celebrating its history and heritage. And tents represent another important aspect of Polish culture, that is the nobility's reverence for freedom. Part of the essence of belonging to the Polish noble class, or szlachta, was a sense of being, quote, as free as air, which meant living peacefully in the idyllic Polish countryside in harmony with nature. This concept of freedom also included freedom of movement, the liberty to travel and see the world. The association between freedom, travel, and tents is succinctly demonstrated by the conclusion of the pamphlet I discussed earlier that dramatized the Battle of Vienna for audiences on the 200th and 300th anniversaries. It recounts Jan Sobieski's accomplishments beyond just the Battle of Vienna, and finishes with an anecdote about how, after the great victory, the hero grew tired of court life and lived out the rest of his days traveling in the countryside and pitching his tent wherever a beautiful valley, picturesque landscapes, the mountain torrent, or any natural object attracted his attention, end quote. With these ideas and ideals in mind, you can see how, centuries after the battle, it seemed like a worthy endeavor to establish the king's former country residence as a museum, where the Polish public could not only celebrate their heritage and history, but to escape to the country and enjoy nature much like their former king once did. Before I finish, I want to return to the tent that opened my talk. And perhaps by now, after looking at several Polish-made tents, you might be able to recognize that this exceptional tent is an authentic example of 17th century Ottoman craftsmanship. And it really is just stunning. Here's an image of the ceiling from below. It's just incredible. So perhaps this tent is the tent that the Grand Vizier resided in on his campaign to conquer the city of Vienna on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. And some people think this one is it. We may never know for sure, and that's sort of the disappointing part of studying the past, right? But for now, I can at least say that this one has not been disproven like some of the others that I have shown you. We do know, though, that the walls of this tent were hung in various rooms in Wawel Castle in Krakow, leading up to and during World War II. And you can see here two different images, one prior to the Polish occupation and one during the Nazi occupation. So did these incredible historical artifacts that were masterfully crafted by artisans employed by the Ottoman Sultan, that later became trophies of victory for Christian Europe and served as symbols of Polish national heritage and pride, acquire even more layers of meaning in the Third Reich? And if so, what are those meanings and connotations? Maybe the Nazi officers used the large fabric panels just for an entirely practical purpose, to block out light in order to show films in a darkened interior. Yeah, one may speculate that perhaps they recognized something of the East in these monumental, densely decorated fabrics. Perhaps they thought their decoration well suited to a movie theater because so many movie theaters built in the early 20th century were themed and styled to look Oriental. Again, we may never know. These are the sort of blessings and curses of researching the past, but we can have fun while we speculate. The defeat of the Ottomans in the Battle of Vienna in 1683 changed the course of European and Ottoman history. For one thing, after almost 400 years of growing their empire, this defeat marked the end of Ottoman expansion. But as I mentioned, history is written by the victors, and the tents that Polish King Jan Sobieski won on that day in September played a prominent role in the story throughout the centuries. The victory became embellished and embedded in the cultural memory of Poland through commemorative artworks, anniversary publications, and museum exhibitions over the years. And art history can be a lot of things. We scholars use different theories and methods of analysis to analyze the past and the great achievements of human creativity and skill. But studies like this show that it's not always about when or even why things were made, but how their meanings change over time as they witness the tides of history. So finally, I want to leave you with a funny, short little anecdote of when I was in Vienna looking at the tents there. Maybe you can see some of this. I was spending a good hour or two with the tents in the gallery, taking hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs on my camera and causing some unease in the museum guards, but they were fine. And I was about to walk away, and this little group of children dressed as like medieval princes and princesses run into the tent. And I snapped a picture of it. And it was just incredible. And I don't speak, German's not one of my languages. But I looked it up on their website later, and they have this service for parents to bring their children to celebrate their birthday. Quote, during a side trip to the faraway Orient, a strange thing is discovered, and a visit to the Turkish tent will surely remain unforgotten. So still to this day, do we have new generations learning about the past and this battle and this moment of European victory through Turkish tents. Thank you.